I think it's important that we try to be a little bit idealistic and hopeful, right? The Bible talks about the power of the tongue. This is why. So, hi everyone. My name is Amira Redwing. I like to talk. I like to talk for my own sanity and hopefully for something to resonate with someone else. But I really implore us all to start having conversations again. So not only is this a reflective space for myself, but it's a space where we can gather in conversations about thoughts and ideas, even if they're not fully formed yet, because I don't know it all. Where do I even start? I'm sitting here, right? And I'm reading this essay back to myself that I've written for this scholarship. The essay question for this scholarship was all about silence. When is silence necessary, or when is it problematic, essentially? And I'm thinking about this question, I'm writing about this question, and I'm realizing that my framework is coming directly from W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness. That everything I'm writing about, summed up, employs the same frame of thinking as this great sociologist. And I'm impressed with myself that I'm able to name this framework, a little bit saddened that it already exists. And you know that saying, like, I've never had an original thought in my life? I was like, yeah, that's true. But I think that's why it's so important that we converse with one another. Because truthfully, I'm sure there's so many equivalent lived experiences and references that we may not be as original in our conception of life as we believe ourselves to be. But I think that this is what Karl Marx was getting at when he talked about class consciousness. The problem is we're not talking or conversing anymore because we've been socialized or are being socialized to believe that our conversations can't produce consequence. We don't have conversations anymore because we don't believe that there is even consequences to a collective consciousness that is brought about by us having conversations. But today, when I was rereading that essay, and I was thinking like, wow, I've never had an original thought in my life, I was also thinking about how brilliant W.E.B. Du Bois was, because he was existing in a time and under social conditions where not only were his thoughts dangerous in essence, but in a space where he had to think about systems in his condition and put language to it before the language to express. My cat has the zoomies. Before the language even existed for him to express those thoughts, right? But he did it anyway, and that's why he's so prolific and like revolutionary. And so I started thinking, like, where do thoughts come from? But then I remembered that I have a framework of understanding for this conversation about where thoughts come from. It's, if you've ever taken a humanities course or even a philosophy course, whether that be in high school or in college, or whether you've simply read about this concept before, you understand the word epistemology. Nolly, please, girl. Dramatic. But epistemology. So, epistemology is basically this theory about how we know what we know, where our thoughts come from. And in my last video, I was talking about how I want my synapses to connect so that I can be who I am in my entirety, and that how lived experiences in my life collide into me becoming. Think of it like a star, right? In the exosphere, the way stars are formed are through this collision of gas. And then you produce something brilliant, beautiful, and bright. That's sort of the same way our thoughts work. Your synapses are connecting. You have lived experiences that are colliding with references, that are colliding with language, that are colliding with curiosity and question. And that's how we're able to produce what we call our thoughts. But delving deeper into epistemology, we see that theory asks questions like, where does knowledge come from? Who gets to determine what is true? What is knowledge? And these are important questions that this theory answers and employs, because when you start to ask yourself, well, okay, or you start, if you sit with yourself and you think like, wow, like I have these thoughts, but where are they coming from? How am I deciding what's true or false? You can start to see how society is almost manufactured in many facets to tell you or to determine what is true, what is false. But often those truth has an author. And that's important in more ways than one. I think today we're going to talk about how that shows up in the legal system and how it shows up in education. And I choose these facets, one, because I am a student right now, and also because that's a field I want to get into. Now, I had a professor tell me once that if you want to understand and argue the law, go to law school. But if you want to change the law, look more towards policy. I think that this question about epistemology also impacts policy. But for now, let's stick to that framework and talk about epistemology, how it defines society in so many ways, how knowledge and who gets to lay claim to what is knowledge impacts us. I'm going to start off first by talking about going back to Du Bois, right? Du Bois, he holds a special place in my perspective because he's from Massachusetts and I'm from Massachusetts. And two, he goes to the Atlanta University Consortium or Center for his undergraduate or formal education originally. So he goes to Morehouse. And then he comes back after going to Harvard and teaches at Atlanta University. And as a student at Clark Atlanta University right now, I am almost jealous that I don't have a time machine to go back and sit in on one of his lectures, number one. But number two, I'm thinking about how a lot of the works that he wrote that came to be such powerful forms of consciousness for our entire community were at this time that he was a professor. So I sat with myself and I said, how did he do it? Because again, like I said, he's discussing at this time he's naming concepts that aren't okay to name, but also he's naming them in new language that hasn't been authored before. But yeah, the role of education in America, we have to start to question it. Because if we're saying that the role of education in America is to be this great equalizer, then we have to assess whether or not that is truly what is being done. I think academia is elitist in many ways. It teaches you that it confuses articulation and intellect, and it also teaches that you have to meet a certain level of articulation in order to have validity in your thoughts, which is wrong in many senses because often our thoughts form before we're able to have the language to express them. And when that language is being policed, how you can or cannot say things, how you should or should not say things, how you should frame things, when it's being policed, you have to ask yourself, is this truly about access? Or is it about exclusion? I guess what I find interesting about Du Bois is where he got his language from. Because at the time, Atlanta University was one of the only, if not, I believe, the only collegiate space or space of higher education that was giving PhDs and affirming legitimacy when it comes to saying that these are people who have studied and are professionals in and legitimate in their space to Black people, right? That school, Atlanta University as a school, Clark Atlanta University, one of the first, if not the first, spaces to affirm Black people in academia, to say that forget your metric, we are legitimate. Legitimacy is important because in political theory, we talk about how legitimacy is the key to discerning power. And I'm going to come back to this concept time and time again of legitimacy. And what I mean by legitimacy is who is legit? Who is legit and how? And who decides and why? But W.E.B. Du Bois, not only was he in this space teaching and professing to students who he, in his mind, were legit, but he was doing so with a particular language that was versed in both his own prior experience and, of course, in the verbiage he would have picked up at an educational institution like Harvard. As someone who grew up in Boston and attended the first school in this country, right? I was introduced to classical literature. I was introduced to Latin. I was introduced to, not even introduced to, forced to study the Romans and the Greeks, classical American canon literature, and analyze it. And it gave me a particular soft skill, I would say. That is an ability to speak the language, I would say, of the white elite. And I name it like that very intentionally, but also weirdly, because that is what it is. But yes, Du Bois had access to language, and he brought that access to language back to Atlanta University and mentored and stewarded students. Powerful. So I'm just in awe. But that's where this conversation comes from, I think. And I want to go back to epistemology and this question about what is knowledge, who defines it, where it comes from, because these questions provide us answers to the root of a lot of inequity that we see in our current society. What do I mean? Okay. We are being told that our knowledge is illegitimate in many senses. Black people aren't given legitimacy in this country. Actually, it has to be earned, but that's a whole other conversation, but not really. But we have knowledge. Our community has knowledge. For example, in education. In academia, we're taught that there's certain ways to do things, whether that be through our writing or speeches, that there's a certain vernacular that needs to be employed, certain verbiage that needs to be used, one that a lot of us didn't actually grow up with. That's where that concept of code switching comes from, right? But do we ever sit and think, why is our vernacular illegitimate? Why isn't our vernacular that might accurately express our thoughts being policed and reared illegitimate, and thus our knowledge being flattened to null, right? It's intentional. And this is where I get into this conversation about the role of academia, the role of education. Because idealistically and paradoxically, we're taught that the role of education in America is about upward mobility, opening doors that you can walk through, right? It's not. Education is definitely a commodity now. I think we know this because a lot of us are understanding that our colleges are businesses, something that you invest in. But whether or not you're truly going to get a return on that is very much based upon your acceptance of the operational definitions about knowledge and acceptance about who is authoring those definitions. Damn. It's not that AAVE is wrong. It's that deeming AAVE as incorrect makes it easy to capitalize on selling packaged knowledge in one standardized form, right? This is why I find my predominantly white high school experience very interesting, because I also realized, though, that access to this language might open doors, but it doesn't give you the authority to step through them. I might have the language, but I don't have the face. And that's important. Soon, and not even soon, almost immediately, I was able to recognize that the legal system is unjust, right? A lot of marginalized brown and black people start to understand that very early on through lived experience. I didn't need to go to a courtroom and watch during my internship to see that. I lived through that. I saw that in my immediate family, in other people in my community's immediate family, blase, blase. But what makes the justice system unjust, what makes law often complicit in injustice, is our operational definitions for a lot of things, is epistemology. So, okay, how this connects to the law. Every legal system uses epistemology, uses this assumption about what counts as valid knowledge and who gets to produce that knowledge in order to operate. And this is so important because it connects to power, it connects to who has power. We say these little sound bites so often, but I don't think we understand them. We say knowledge is power. But I don't think that people often understand the deeper assertion that's being made when someone says knowledge has power. And in the legal system, it has real world implications. When people talk about the law, right, they often say that the law values reasoning and evidence and logic and credibility, right? What I mean by this, is this witness credible? So in mock trial, you talk about the expert witness, but the whole time before you start questioning that expert witness on what it is you're trying to prove, you have to establish credibility. You have to demonstrate to the jury that this person is who they say they are, that they are legit, that they know what they're talking about, that they have knowledge. And so you ask them questions to establish that baseline. I think that there is a distinction between what the law privileges and what it actually is in practice. It's not about neutrality. I'll give another example that more people might know about from my time at mock trial, but also this is like general law knowledge, and like I feel like most people know this word because it's sort of thrown around as a sound, not a soundbite, but in humor often, right? Hearsay, like what is hearsay? And then like people are like, okay, hearsay, he said, she said. But what is hearsay in law? Hearsay in law is basically a statement that is said by someone, maybe a third party, who actually can't validate what they said because they're not able to testify. And what they're actually saying is you actually can't validate or prove or be definite about the fact that this person said this, because we aren't able to discern any legitimacy from this person. We don't or can't assess this person's authorship of their knowledge. And that is intentional in so many regards. And you see, this is important because in law, truth and admissibility are two different things. And when I did mock trial, and as I sit with a lot of that now, I realize that. And it's when you do mock trial, I don't know about law school because I'm not in law school, but when you do mock trial, that's never clearly stated, or at least it wasn't to me. You are never told flat right out that truth and admissibility aren't the same thing. You understand that through the way some of your truthful points aren't admissible. Like, you learned that, but it's never explicitly stated. And I think that's low-key intentional, because when you start to think about the why behind that, things get a little rocky. The legal system starts to become a little bit questionable. The framework for it starts to crumble ethically, socially, and if we're talking about inequity or establishing equity and not just equality, then the situation, the framework becomes really odd and questionable. What I'm trying to get at, I think, is that knowing doesn't equate to legitimacy, and that oftentimes when knowing is not given space or argument or ability to be that which is legitimate, you have to ask, who is determining what makes this knowledge legitimate or not? Because if the people who are defining legitimacy or an individual's thoughts as legitimate don't have pure motives or intentions, then you can see where things start to get real weird. And this is the root, I think, to a lot of our quandaries in society. They say that knowledge is power. I hope that you see more meaning behind that snippet now. I don't want to sit with any resolutions. Not, I don't want to. I do have resolutions to these theories that I'm discussing, but I don't know about sharing them on the internet just yet. But that's my little TED Talk for today. So hopefully y'all liked it, and I hope I communicated it in a way that was easy to express. Again, I'm working on long form content, and I appreciate any type of feedback. We are going to touch upon this subject more soon, I think. But for now, thank you for watching. And if you like this video, like, subscribe, possibly leave a comment, share it with a friend, because knowledge is power. I know that's right. Bye, y'all.